On January 4, 2024, Iranian commandos rappelled from helicopters onto the deck of a tanker in the Gulf of Oman. Within minutes, they had seized control of the vessel and diverted it to Iranian waters. This wasn't an act of piracy, it was state policy, and it wasn't the first time. From the Strait of Hormuz to the South China Sea, nations continue to seize merchant ships as weapons of war and diplomacy. But why? The answer lies in a century of conflict where controlling oil became more valuable than controlling territory, and where a single tanker could shift the balance of global power. This is the story of how oil transformed naval warfare, how weak nations learned to strangle empires, and why seizing ships remains one of the most dangerous flashpoints in international relations. To understand why nations seize oil ships, we need to go back to the moment when oil became the bloodline of modern civilization. In the early 20th century, the world ran on coal, but oil was superior. It contained more energy per pound, burned cleaner, and most importantly, could power a new generation of machines that would change warfare forever. The British Royal Navy was the first to understand this. In 1911, Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, made a radical decision. Britain would convert its entire battleship fleet from coal to oil. This gave British warships a massive advantage. Oil-powered ships were faster, had greater range, and didn't require armies of sailors shoveling coal into furnaces. But there was one problem. Britain had coal in abundance, but virtually no oil. Churchill's solution was to look abroad. Britain secured oil supplies from Persia, modern-day Iran, establishing what would become British Petroleum. Other powers followed suit. By World War I, oil had become a strategic commodity more valuable than gold. The nation that controlled oil could project power across oceans. The nation that lost access to oil would lose wars. World War I proved this brutally. Germany, cut off from oil supplies by British naval blockades, struggled to fuel its war machine. Meanwhile, the Allies, with access to American and Middle Eastern oil, kept their tanks rolling and their ships sailing. Germany's synthetic fuel programs couldn't compensate. By 1918, the German army was literally running on empty. But it was World War II that truly demonstrated oil's decisive importance and introduced the world to the strategy of targeting enemy oil supplies. When war broke out in 1939, both sides understood that oil would determine the outcome. Germany had learned from its World War I defeat. Hitler's entire strategy in the East was driven by oil. The invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 aimed ultimately at the oil fields of Baku in the Caucasus. Japan faced an even desperate oil situation. The Japanese Empire consumed vast amounts of oil, but produced almost none domestically. Japan imported 80% of its oil, and most of that came from the United States. When Japan invaded French Indochina in 1941, threatening French and Dutch colonies, President Roosevelt responded with an oil embargo. The embargo was devastating. Japan had oil reserves for perhaps 18 months of normal consumption, far less if war broke out. Japanese military planners faced a terrible choice: back down and abandon their imperial ambitions, or go to war before their oil ran out. They chose war. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 was fundamentally about oil. Japan's strategy was to seize the oil-rich Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, before America could stop them. And initially, the strategy worked. Japanese forces swept through Southeast Asia, capturing oil fields in Burma, the East Indies, and Borneo. For a brief moment, Japan secured the oil it needed. But then came the American counterattack, and with it, a strategy that would define naval warfare for the next century. American submarines began systematically hunting Japanese tankers and merchant ships. This was unrestricted submarine warfare, sink anything carrying supplies to Japan. The campaign was devastatingly effective. By 1945, American submarines had sunk over 1,100 Japanese merchant vessels. Japan's oil imports dropped to nearly zero. Japanese planes couldn't fly, ships couldn't sail, and factories couldn't produce. Japan was strangled by its own supply lines. The lesson was clear. In modern warfare, controlling sea lanes and oil shipments could be as important as winning battles. Cutting off oil supplies could cripple even a powerful military. This lesson would be remembered. After World War II, oil became even more central to global power. The discovery of massive oil reserves in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, Iran, shifted the world's energy center of gravity. These nations sat atop the largest concentration of easily accessible oil on the planet. Whoever controlled Middle Eastern oil controlled the global economy. The problem was that most of this oil needed to pass through narrow maritime choke points to reach consumers. The most important of these was the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. Nearly a third of all seaborne oil passes through Hormuz. Close that strait, and you could paralyze industrial economies thousands of miles away. Nations quickly realized this geography created a new kind of power, the power of denial. A country didn't need a massive navy to influence global affairs. It just needed the ability to threaten ships in strategic waters. This was a weapon weak states could use against strong ones. The 1973 Arab-Israeli War demonstrated this dramatically. When the United States supported Israel, Arab oil-producing nations imposed an embargo on oil exports to America and their allies. Global oil prices quadrupled. Western economies plunged into recession. Long lines formed at gas stations across the United States. The lesson was unmistakable. Control of oil supplies could be weaponized, and the effects were immediate and severe. But embargoes were blunt instruments. They hurt everyone, including the countries imposing them. A more targeted approach was needed, one that could pressure specific adversaries without collapsing global markets. Enter the strategy of selectively seizing individual ships. The Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988 marked the first large-scale use of this strategy. Both nations realized they couldn't defeat each other on land. The war had bogged down into brutal trench warfare. So both sides began attacking each other's oil exports. If I can't win, neither can you. Iraqi jets bombed Iranian oil facilities and tankers. Iran retaliated by attacking tankers carrying Iraqi oil and oil from Iraq's Arab supporters like Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. This became known as the Tanker War. Between 1984 and 1988, over 450 merchant ships were attacked in the Persian Gulf. Crews lived in constant fear. Shipping insurance rates skyrocketed. The international community was horrified. Global oil supplies were threatened by two regional powers. The United States and other Western nations began escorting tankers through the Gulf with naval warships. This led to direct confrontations. In 1988, the USS Vince, on escort duty, accidentally shot down an Iranian civilian airliner, killing 290 people. The tragedy highlighted how quickly tanker conflicts could spiral into disasters. But the tanker war also established a precedent. Attacking civilian shipping was now an accepted tool of conflict in the Middle East. The international rules against such actions had proven unenforceable when nations felt desperate enough. After the Cold War ended, a new pattern emerged. Instead of attacking or sinking ships, nations began seizing them, taking vessels and their crews hostage. This was a more subtle strategy. Sinking a ship risked environmental catastrophe, international condemnation, and military retaliation. But seizing a ship, that could be portrayed as law enforcement, as enforcing territorial rights, as a temporary measure. It was deniable, reversible, and harder to respond to. Iran pioneered this approach. Starting in the 1990s and accelerating in the 2000s, Iranian forces began periodically seizing foreign vessels in the Persian Gulf. Sometimes the justification was alleged territorial violations, sometimes it was retaliation for sanctions, sometimes no clear reason was given at all. In 2007, Iran seized 15 British sailors and Marines, holding them for 2 weeks before releasing them. In 2019, Iran seized a British-flagged tanker in apparent retaliation for British forces detaining an Iranian tanker near Gibraltar. The pattern was clear: seize ships, create international incidents, extract concessions, release the ships. It was coercion without war. Other nations watched and learned. China began employing similar tactics in the South China Sea. Venezuela seized ships it accused of sanctions violations. Even established naval powers like the United States and Britain began using ship seizures as a tool, detaining Iranian tankers accused of sanctions violations or smuggling. The modern era of ship seizures is defined by several factors. First, international law has become incredibly complex around maritime boundaries, territorial waters, and enforcement rights. This complexity creates gray areas nations can exploit. Is a ship in Iranian territorial waters or international waters? Different nations claim different boundaries. Who decides? Second, ship seizures are visible but limited. They create headlines demonstrating strength and resolve to domestic audiences, but they stop short of sinking ships or killing sailors, actions that would demand military responses. Seizures are calibrated coercion. Third, ship seizures are often tied to sanctions regimes. As the United States and European Union have imposed ever-expanding sanctions on countries like Iran, North Korea, and Venezuela, those nations have retaliated by seizing ships they claim are violating their rights. It's tit-for-tat enforcement, with each side claiming legal authority. Fourth, technology has made seizures easier. Modern maritime tracking systems mean nations know exactly where every major ship is at all times. Helicopters and fast boats can intercept tankers before they reach safety. Once commandos are aboard a tanker, the crew has little choice but to comply. Modern tankers have tiny crews with no weapons. But ship seizures remain incredibly dangerous. They operate in a legal and military gray zone where miscalculation can trigger disasters. What if a crew resists? What if a Navy escort fires on boarding commandos? What if a seized ship causes an oil spill? Each seizure contains the seeds of potential escalation. The Strait of Hormuz remains the world's most dangerous maritime choke point. Iran has repeatedly threatened to close the strait in response to sanctions or military pressure. Western naval forces maintain a constant presence to keep it open. One miscalculation, one nervous sailor pulling a trigger, could trigger a regional war that disrupts global energy supplies. The South China Sea presents similar risks. China claims vast areas as its territorial waters. Other nations reject these claims. Chinese forces have seized fishing vessels, confronted oil exploration ships, and threatened tankers. As China's navy grows stronger and its territorial ambitions expand, the risk of confrontation increases. Climate change and the energy transition add new complexity. As the world slowly shifts away from oil toward renewable energy, oil-dependent nations face an uncertain future. This creates incentives for desperate actions. A nation watching its primary source of wealth evaporate might take greater risks, seize more ships, and provoke more confrontations. Meanwhile, new choke points are emerging. As Arctic ice melts, new shipping routes are opening through Arctic waters. Russia, with its vast Arctic coastline, is already positioning itself to control these routes. Will we see ship seizures in the Arctic as nations compete for control? The fundamental problem hasn't changed since World War II. Modern civilization runs on energy. That energy must be transported, mostly by ship, through narrow passages controlled by rival nations.
Any nation that can threaten those passages gains leverage far beyond its military or economic size. Ship seizures are a rational response to this reality. They're cheaper than building massive navies, they're less risky than open warfare, they're more targeted than broad embargoes, they generate publicity and demonstrate resolve. For smaller nations facing larger adversaries, seizing ships is one of the few asymmetric tools available. But rationality doesn't mean safety. History shows that calculated strategies can spiral into uncontrolled conflicts. The assassination of an Austrian archduke was meant to be a targeted political statement. It triggered World War I. Ship seizures, meant to be calibrated coercion, could similarly escalate beyond anyone's control. So, what's the solution? International law attempts to regulate maritime conduct, but enforcement is weak when major powers are involved. Economic diversification could reduce oil dependence, but that's a decades-long process. Military escorts can protect some ships, but they also increase the risk of confrontation. Perhaps the only real solution is the one nations resist most: genuine diplomatic engagement and mutual respect for maritime rights. As long as nations see ship seizures as effective tools, they'll continue using them. Only when the risks clearly outweigh the benefits will the practice stop. Until then, tankers will continue sailing through dangerous waters, crews will watch their radar screens nervously, commandos will stand ready in helicopters, and the world will remain one seized ship away from a crisis that could disrupt global commerce and trigger military confrontation. The strategy of seizing oil ships emerged from a century of conflict over the world's most vital resource. It reflects the brutal logic of modern geopolitics, that controlling energy flows means controlling power. As long as oil flows through narrow choke points controlled by rival nations, those nations will be tempted to seize ships. The only question is whether we'll find a better way to resolve these conflicts before one seizure too many triggers the disaster everyone fears. Because in the end, every nation that seizes a ship is gambling that they can control the escalation, that the other side will back down, that miscalculation won't occur. History shows that's a bet that eventually, inevitably, someone will lose. Thanks for watching. If you found this exploration of maritime strategy and energy geopolitics interesting, make sure to subscribe for more content on how history shapes our present dangers. Next time, we'll examine another flashpoint where past conflicts create present risks. Until then, remember, the routes that bring us oil also bring us closer to conflict.